And welcome back to Dear Disney Presents Walt Disney an American Original, Section 4, Chapter 18. The Disney fortunes began to turn in 1950. The long Hunger Years ended with the public acceptance of The Cinderella, the first unqualified hit for the studio since Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Treasure Island was also well received, and the second of the true life adventures, Beaver Valley, proved even more popular than Seal Island. By the end of 1950, the debt to the Bank of America had been reduced to $1,700,000. The new, unaccustomed prosperity relieved Walt of the anxiety he had felt in the floundering post-war years. The worried scowl that studio workers had grown accustomed to now appeared less often. In April 1951, he wrote to his producer in England, Percy Pierce. Everything is looking well here at the plant. Alice is just about ready to be wrapped up, and I think it's about as good as can be done with it. I think it's going to be an excellent show. While it does have the tempo of a three-ring circus, it still has plenty of entertainment, and it should satisfy everyone except a certain handful who can never be satisfied. He revealed his reservations about Alice in Wonderland. He had wrestled with the subject since 1933 when he contemplated a version with Mary Pickford as a live-action Alice. Years later, he planned to put Ginger Rogers in a cartoon Wonderland. Aldous Huxley had one time worked on a script. Walt had banned his Alice in Wonderland again and again until finally he scheduled it to follow Cinderella. He dropped the idea of a live-action Alice. Practically everyone who has read and loved the Book of Necessity sees the Tenniel Alice, he explained in a letter to a New Jersey fan, and no matter how close we approximate her with a living Alice, I feel the result would be a disappointment. Walt tried to alter the storyline to fit the cartoon needs, at one time expanding the role of the White Knight as a hero rescuer, but he was intimidated by the threats of Lewis Carroll's purists, and he returned to the original story. During storyboard sessions, Walt tried to maintain his normal enthusiasm, but it was difficult. Animation was as tedious as the story development. Walt kept asking his animators why the drawing was taking so much time. The unspoken answer was that the animators weren't enjoying it. The animators sometimes arrived at brilliant invention, but it was punishing work. Everyone felt relief when Alice in Wonderland was finished, especially Walt. He vowed never again to undertake a tamper-proof classic. He had hoped to keep face with the traditionalists while trying to please the millions who expected an entertaining show from Walt Disney. He satisfied neither. Alice in Wonderland had its premiere in Lewis Carroll's home country, and London critics belabored Disney for the liberties he took. American audiences were also disappointed, and the film lost $1 million, erasing the glow of prosperity that Cinderella had brought to Walt Disney Productions. Someday, Walt sighed, I would like to reach the position where this company doesn't have to live from one picture to the next. Peter Pan was the next cartoon. Walt had bought the rights to the James M. Barrie play in 1939 and had spent years trying to fashion a cartoon story. As with Alice in Wonderland, he found it difficult to bring warmth to the characters, and Peter Pan was set aside from time to time. Then in 1951, Walt put it into production. With the studio expanding into new fields, he could no longer lavish time on all aspects of the film. His comments and storyboard sessions seemed more succinct, though no less incisive. We don't have the right crocodile yet. It's out of character. Watch so as not to get Hook's teeth too big. Rebuild the TikTok scene of Hook. Get expression of fear in his eyes. I don't like the hair raising. Smee cries too much. We want to make the music a little more important. I think music will tie it together. Don't hesitate to reshoot anything you need. Anything you don't need, don't hesitate to throw it away after you have looked at it. An overlap is never good. Cut close. On the last C, you need room for Smee to compose himself before he sticks out his tongue. Then, whoom! I like the business of Hook getting all dolled up. It's good business. You hear the creaking of the ship in the tick-tock? Have a ray of light streaming out from the porthole, and the crocodile would be swimming around in the water in the stream of light. And at a certain point, we would see his eyes. When we get the fight going on the ship and the croc finally comes in, it should be a nice surprise. I was thinking of the fight, the tempo. I was thinking of the fight, the tempo would pick up and the croc's tail would wave faster. Perhaps arrange a few places where Peter Pan might have hook out over the water and the croc is waiting. But don't slow it up. Walt was planning a second English made live action feature, The Story of Robin Hood, for filming in the summer of 1951. His pre production memos to his aides in England, Percy Pierce and Fred Lee, indicated his concentration on details. The final tests arrived the first part of the week, and we looked at them. I think Richard Todd is wonderful, and I feel he will project a great deal of personality and do a lot for the role. Joan Rice is beautiful and charming. I think, however, she will need some help on her dialogue. I thought at times she lacked sincerity, although one of her close ups was very cute. I do not care much about her costumes in the first scene. It seems that women of that period always have scarves up around their chins, but I think it does something to a woman's face. I like to see us avoid it if possible, or get around it in some way or other, maybe use it in a fewer scenes. When we see Miss Rice disguised as a page, this costume seems bulky and heavy. The blouse or tunic was too long and hung too far down over her hips. It didn't show enough of her, and I thought it distracted from her femininity. I do not believe the costume did much to set off her femininity. I think a slight showing of the hips would help a lot. I liked Elton Hayes as Alan Adale. He has a good voice with quite an appeal. The last word I had from Larry Watkin was to the fact that he would be sending in a new and completed script very soon. I've been following his changes, and the little thoughts I have are close to lint picking, which I feel he is smoothing out in the final script. So I won't bother about passing on my thoughts until I get his so-called final script. Television was also occupying Walt's thinking. The networks had been importuning him to provide entertainment for the new medium. And in 1950, Walt agreed to produce a Christmas show for the National Broadcasting Company. As producer, he assigned Bill Walsh, a one-time publicist who began at the studio as a gag writer for the Mickey Mouse comic strips in 1943. Walt acted as guide to the studio for ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy, Charlie McCarthy, and Mortimer Snerd. And the Disney Daughters also appeared on the show. It attracted a huge audience, impressing Walt with the value of television as a signboard for the studio's theatrical product. Another Christmas special was produced in 1951. Walt foresaw a future for educational films on television, and he reactivated the studio's educational division. With his work at the studio intensifying, Walt found relaxation in his hobby of miniatures. He began by making his own small objects for the caboose of the Carrollwood Pacific train. He spent hours nightly fashioning tiny replicas of furniture in the red barn he used for a workshop. His long, slender, dexterous fingers allowed him to manipulate small objects with inordinate skill. He was fascinated with small objects, and he collected them during his travels to Europe. When Lily, Diane, and Sharon returned from a shopping tour of Paris, they found Walt on the floor of their hotel suite, surrounded by small animated animals. He was particularly impressed with the caged bird, which moved its tail and beak and issued an intermittent song. He brought the bird to the studio and instructed one of his technicians, Walter Rogers, "Take this apart and find out how it works." Rogers performed an autopsy on the bird and discovered that it was operated by clockworks and a double bellows. One day, Walt said to Ken Anderson, "I'm having everybody else around here do the drawings and paintings. I'm going to do something creative myself. I'm going to put you on my personal payroll, and I want you to draw 24 scenes of life in an old western town. Then I'll carve the figures and make the scenes in miniature. When we get enough of them made, we'll send them out as a traveling exhibit. We'll get an office here at the studio, and you and I will be the only ones who'll have the keys." While Anderson started working on the sketches, Walt placed an advertisement in newspapers and hobby magazines seeking vintage miniatures of all kinds. He began working on the first of the scenes, which he called Granny Kincaid's Cabin, based on the set of So Dear to My Heart. Everything was depicted in scale: the spinning wheel, rag rug on the plank floor, flintlock rifle on the wall, guitar, wash bowl, and pitcher, family Bible on the center table. In the bedroom beyond the living room could be seen the feather bed, four-poster with crazy quilt. The kitchen was equipped with a wood-burning stove and tiny pots and utensils. Walt attended to every detail. For the chimney, he picked up pebbles at his vacation home in Palm Springs. To bend wood into the counter of chairs, he borrowed the pressure cooker from the family kitchen. He planned Granny Kincaid's cabin without human figures. Viewers would hear the voice of Granny describing the scenes, and Walt recorded a narration of Beulah Bondi, who had played Granny in So Dear to My Heart. Even before he finished Granny Kincaid's cabin, Walt was planning a more ambitious scene. He wanted movement into the miniatures, and he devised a frontier music hall with an entertainer performing a dance. To provide a model for the figure, he hired Buddy Ebsen to demonstrate an old-time dance before the camera. Then Walt asked his machine shop crew to analyze the action, frame by frame, and try to devise a way to animate a 9-inch figure with the same movements. Roger Brogy and the shop technicians invented a system of cables and cams to make the figure dance. "That's great," said Walt as he watched the antic dance off the little man. "Now let's try something different." His new project was a miniature barbershop quartet that would not only move but sing Sweet Adeline. The machine shop improved on the dancing man mechanism and routed the quartet to a minute and a half of singing. Walt began dropping by the shop every day to observe the progress on the models. Often he lost track of time, and his secretary called frantically to inquire, "Is Walt still there? He's an hour late on his appointments." Walt's schemes for the traveling exhibit was to depict a series of interconnected small town scenes. The general store window could be seen from the barbershop, etc. But the project never got beyond early stages of the singing quartet. Walt realized that the small size of the exhibit would not allow enough volume of viewers to make it profitable. Besides, he wanted his craftsmen to devote their efforts to the amusement park he wanted to build. Roy Disney continued his opposition to the park. He argued that with the failure of Alice in Wonderland, the company had fallen deeper into debt, and a venture as risky as an amusement park simply couldn't be financed. Walt responded by citing an incident of their childhood. It had happened in April 1906 when the Disney family was en route from Chicago to Marceline. During the visit to Flora's sister in Fort Madison, Walt found a pocket knife in the street. "Give it to me, you'll cut yourself," and his older brother appropriated the knife. 45 years later, Walt prodded Roy. "Yeah, it's just like the time you took that knife away from me in Fort Madison. You've been taking things away from me all my life." When Walt Disney was a young man, a fortune teller had predicted that he would die at the time of his birthday before he reached the age of 35. Although he is not superstitious, the prediction had a profound effect on him, and he continued to brood about it long after it had proved false. The sense of mortality weighed on him, and he seemed to be in a race against time to accomplish all the work he wanted to do. "I hate to see the weekend come," he remarked, complaining of the break in his usual pace. Similarly, he resented holidays. He enjoyed taking Lily and their daughters to Europe and delighted in showing them a place he had known in the First World War. But while he was away, he instructed his secretary to send him daily reports of studio activities. "You don't know how homesick I am when I'm away," he said. Walt's devotion to work limited his social life. He liked to watch the Hollywood Stars baseball team at Gilmore Stadium and occasionally attend the horse races at Santa Anita and Hollywood Park. On warm summer evenings, he and Lily listened to the symphonies under the stars at the Hollywood Bowl. They dined out at Chassen's, Romanoff's, and Trader Vic's, but most of the time they ate at home. Their entertaining was generally with small dinner parties, and they were strictly social, not business. Walt grew better looking as he matured. By the time he reached 50, his 5-foot 10-inch frame had filled out, and his face seemed more distinguished. His hair remained as thick as ever, assuming an edge of gray. The mustache, which had given him a dapper appearance in his earlier years, looked appropriate now. Oddly, he didn't like actors with mustaches in his movies. He thought they looked like city slickers. His taste in clothes grew more conservative. He no longer wore the sporty outfits of his early Hollywood days. He insisted that his clothes be comfortable, and he rarely wore a necktie at the studio, preferring Western-style neckerchiefs with a smoke tree ranch insignia of which he had dozens. His wife and daughters found it impossible to buy clothes for him, except for sweaters and handkerchiefs. He preferred to choose his own outfits, and every 2 years he went to Bullock's Wilshire and Los Angeles and bought a supply. Whenever his jackets were sent to the cleaners, the pockets had to be emptied of the crackers and nuts he carried for snacks while he was working. Walt dressed and undressed swiftly. One evening, Sharon commented that he hadn't changed his clothes for a friend's party that was beginning in a few minutes. "It'll only take me a couple minutes to dress," Walt replied. "Besides, it doesn't matter if I'm late. All they do is stand around and drink." The Disneys spent Easter, Thanksgiving, and between Christmas and New Year's at Smoke Tree Ranch, a Palm Springs development where families maintained vacation homes, taking meals in a communal dining room. The girls were growing up. In 1951, Diane entered the University of Southern California, and Sharon was a sophomore at Westlake High School. Walt attended parents' night at Sharon's school, sometimes complaining about too much homework for his daughter, and went to the dad's dinner at Diane's sorority. He was convinced that Sharon, whose grades were sometimes mediocre, was the beauty of the family, and Diane was the brain. He encouraged Diane to write, explaining that women had been successful in contributing scripts to the studio. He showed copies of her humorous poems to visitors to his office, and sent her short stories to the story department for analysis. He enjoyed watching his daughters mature, but he resented the passing of their childhood. Once, when he was visiting friends, a little girl sat on his lap. Memories of the younger Diane and Sharon returned, and he told the girl, "I think you better get down, dear, or you're going to see your Uncle Walt cry." He cried easily as his daughter's graduation over scripts, sometimes the same movie scene he saw over and over. Since he was stinted with praise, his animators considered it a triumph if Walt cried at a scene they had created. He was growing more conservative. By 1940, he no longer supported Franklin Roosevelt and he voted for Wendell Willkie. His politics remained Republican thereafter. In the late 1940s, he took an active role in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, formed by industrial leaders who were concerned about the communist influence in Hollywood. Communist support of the strike against his studio remained a bitter memory for Walt Disney. He had become disillusioned in his role as employer, explaining, "It went way back to the time when I had this little studio with kitchen chairs and old benches to sit on, and the drawing boards that I had made myself. I used to sit in that chair all day long myself, and knew how hard it could get. So I got some old cushions and pillows to sit on. We got all these ragtag pillows all around. Every guy'd have a different one. So one day we got a little money, and I talked Roy into letting me buy some new rubber foam cushions. I gave each guy a cushion for his chair, and gosh, they were happy and grateful. One of the guys got his own cushion, and now he had two cushions on his chair. The next thing I knew, all of these fellows were demanding two cushions. I said, gosh, that's the limit. They were happy with no cushions. I give them a cushion, they want two." At times when Walt and Roy could not afford cash bonuses, they gave their workers payments in common stock. From a par value of $5 in 1945, the price climbed to $15 in 1946. Then tumbled as the company underwent its post-war adjustment. Many employees sold their stock, and Walt considered an act of disloyalty and lack of faith in the company. Walt himself was convinced that the studio would revive, and he bought stock at its low ebb. The stock was his principal asset, and although he lived well by Hollywood standards, he was not a rich man. When a doctor friend asked to borrow $5,000 in 1951, Walt wrote him, "I know my answer to your request will sound funny, but I haven't got the money. I'm strapped myself and have borrowed to the hilt on my insurance on personal notes. I'm close to $50,000 in debt, which is the limit of my personal borrowing ability. The new house cost much more than I anticipated, and consequently, I'm really up to my neck. So I can only say that I'm sorry that I'm unable to comply with your request." He was unconcerned about amassing money for himself, but he worried about his family's future in the event of his death. He paid little heed to his personal bank account, which his secretary, Dolores Walt Scott, supervised. Roy often asked her, "How are Walt's finances? Don't let him get involved in some crazy scheme." Walt's daily routine began with meetings at 8 and 8:30. He reviewed storyboards in other offices or held conferences around a low square table in his own office. When he had no visitors for lunch, he ate at his desk, his favorite meal being chili and beans. He was a connoisseur, preferring to combine a can of Gebhardts, which had much meat and few beans, with a can of Denisons, which had less meat and more beans. The dish was preceded by a glass of VA juice and accompanied by soda crackers. If visitors were coming to lunch, they were ushered into Walt's conference room at noon. He served them an aperitif of VA juice, a ritual that puzzled European visitors who were accustomed to something stronger. Walt discoursed for half an hour and then led his visitors to the choral room of the commissary, where the tables in the northeast corner was reserved for him. Walt often used the lunches for press interviews. He realized the value of publicity in the selling of motion pictures, and he made himself available for all requests that his publicity director, Joseph Reddy, considered to be of value. Walt seemed to enjoy interviews, not merely for his ego satisfaction. He liked to sum up the activities of his company, to reflect on his problems and triumphs, to try out a new story idea on an outsider. The Disney interview was an unstructured affair. Walt usually began expounding on the matters that had accompanied him that morning. He continued talking about the many projects of the studio, responding occasionally to an interjected question. After lunch, Walt liked to climb in a golf cart and show the visitor what was happening on the studio stages and in the shops. More meetings were scheduled in the afternoon, and he often left the office to inspect projects in the shop. At 5 in the afternoon, he quit work for his stretching exercises, a drink of scotch, and a rub-down. By the end of the day, Walt was in considerable pain from the old polo injury to his neck. One day in 1951, he complained about it to Floyd Odium, the industrialist who had long been promoting research in treatment of arthritis. Walt wrote Odium about a specialist Odium had recommended. "He diagnosed my case as a form of arthritis, but not the usual variety. It seems I have a calcium deposit that continues building up in my neck, which is probably caused by a polo injury I received." He didn't diagnose my case as a form of arthritis, but not the usual variety. It seems I have a calcium deposit that continues building up in my neck, which is probably caused by a polo injury I have received some years ago when I took a spill from my horse. He thinks he can relieve this condition somewhat, but he has also convinced me that I will probably have to live with it the rest of my life. My heart and other vital organs, along with the history of my ancestry, all have indicated that I'm going to live a long life. So I'm going to have to learn to live with this condition and make the best of it. Hazel George, the studio nurse, applied the treatment. It consisted of hot packs and intermittent traction. She tried a prone position, which would have allowed the heat and traction to be applied at the same time. Walt declined because he couldn't sip his drink at the same time. I'll give you a straw, Hazel suggested. The treatment was administered in a room next to Walt's office, and he called it his laughing place, as in the Uncle Remus's story. It is where he could gain a perspective on the day's activities, exchange gossip with Hazel, confide his plans. Walt, who had received honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, and the University of California, once remarked to Hazel, I'd trade all my degrees for your real one. She advised him it would be a bad idea. It would ruin your work would lose its originality, its spontaneity. One evening, in a mellow mood, Walt reflected to Hazel, I finally found who I am. Who are you? Hazel asked. I'm the last of the benevolent monarchs. She thought about it and replied, That's good. Now I know what I am. What's that? The last of the court jesters. The conversations with Hazel sometimes grew philosophical, and once she and Walt were discussing various kinds of love, parents for children, human beings for pets, etc. As sometimes happened, Walt tired of the conversation and ended with a summation. Well, Hazel, let's face it. Love is like everything else. If you don't have it, you can't give it. The heat treatment and traction lasted 45 minutes, and Walt felt relaxed and refreshed, eager to return to work. Hazel tried to discourage him, but she was not always successful. He sometimes called a story meeting that lasted into the evening. Dinner was kept waiting for him at home. He ate heartily and sometimes had to cut down his consumption when his weight pushed over 185 pounds. When research connected to animal fats with the occurrence of heart disease, he asked the doctor, Does that mean eating fats could make you old before your time? He was told it did, and Walt went on a diet to cut down on fats. But he wouldn't quit smoking. He admitted that he was wrong in smoking. One day he mused to Hazel, You're right about all one thing. Smoking and drinking are sins, because you are one of God's creatures, and if you don't take care of your body he gave you, you're committing a sin. He still smoked. On rare occasions, Walt went out in the evening to banquets and civic dinners. He disliked such affairs, but he agreed to attend out of duty. When a formal speech was expected, he agonized over it. He detested the stilted speeches that were written for him. I don't use all those big words. It make it sound like me. Walt was most effective when he had no written speech, but merely talking to the audience as he would in normal conversation. He could evoke in as many laughs as a stand-up comedian. Walt never told jokes, either before an audience or in conversation. Employees learned not to try to tell him jokes since he hadn't the patience to listen to them. Telling a dirty joke to Walt could evoke a stony silence. Not that he was prudish. Like any farm boy, he had learned about sex at an early age. To him, sex was not a ludicrous subject, nor did it hold any great mystery. Above all, he believed that sex was a private matter, and that is the way he preferred to leave it. He refused to be treated as a special person because of his position as head of an overgrowing enterprise. He allowed no one to light his cigarettes, help him on with his coat, or hold doors open for him. Sycophantic employees lasted a brief time around Walt. When he visited a movie set or walked down a hall, he didn't like to be accosted. His time was limited and he wanted to choose the persons he talked to, whether it was a producer or a prop man. He especially disliked being burdened with other personal problems. As the studio grew, it became more and more difficult for Walt to remember the names of his workers. To assist his memory, he had the personnel department supply his office with a complete file so he could match names and photographs of those he encountered in his daily rounds. Disney works, even those with a long time service at the studio, were perplexed over how to react in casual encounters with the boss. They realized that he could be concentrated on an important company matter and would not want to be disturbed. But those who did not greet him were sometimes given a gruff, What's the matter? You mad at me? A secretary faced the dilemma one afternoon as she found herself walking towards Walt in the long, lonely corridor of the animation building's third floor. He seemed to be immersed in thought, and she decided her best plan was to pass him without a greeting. As she did so, she heard a voice, almost disembodied, like a ventriloquist, say, Hi, good looking! She was puzzled. After she'd gone 10 paces, she turned to look at the retreating figure. At that moment, Walt swung around, pointed her finger, and exclaimed in impish, Ha! Then continued on his way. Thank you again for your time this wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And remember, today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day.